Hey everyone, this is Francesca Vigliani from Cloud Academy. Thank you for joining us for this new webinar on FastAPI for data science with our data scientist, Andrea Giussani. I'm seeing so many people that have already attended the previous sessions with Andrea, so welcome back. And to all the new people, thank you for joining us. Before introducing our speaker and the topic, as usual, just a couple of housekeeping announcements. So as you know, the webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you via email as soon as it is available. At the end of this session, we will hold a Q&A, so feel free to submit your questions through the chat box. You should be able to see a box where you can type in your questions, and we will monitor everything that will come in during and throughout the webinar, so feel free to send them now and we'll try to answer them either on the spot or during the final Q&A. And let's see who did their homework. Did you set up the environment in advance? If not, please go to the GitHub repository you have in the registration email. I will share it here in the chat as well as a reminder. And be sure you clone it on your local environment. If you already did it, please pull up the latest version. All right, I'm all done with the announcement. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our data scientist, Andrea Giussani. Take it away, Andrea.
Thank you, Francesca, and welcome everybody. Again, it's so nice to see so many people even today, and thank you for participating. We appreciate a lot your presence here. So just a brief introduction of myself, as usual. I'm a data scientist here at Cloud Academy, where I mainly focus on the development of machine learning algorithms to provide state-of-the-art solutions to improve the quality of our product. You can reach me out on LinkedIn, or you can visit my website for updates on machine learning or Python in general. This is quite a hands-on webinar, different from the one that you have attended previously with me. So I will basically perform all the necessary steps live with you, but don't worry about the code because I will upload at the end of the webinar all the source code in the GitHub repository. The URL is provided in the registration email, and there I will also upload some specification and extra material in the next few days. So stay tuned. The agenda goes as follows. We are going to understand what we are going to cover today. And in particular, as the title suggests, we are going to use and explore FastAPI. And so we are going to understand from a generic point of view what FastAPI is and the pros and cons of using that framework. And then we are going to understand the learning objectives, the necessary environment that you should have on your local env. But in general, it's not strictly necessary that you have set up everything, because my suggestion is try to follow the webinar, try to get the most, and then you have all the material to try by yourself and get your hands dirty. Okay, so this webinar is for anyone who wants to build an API with Python as the backend language. So basically, in order to successfully attend this webinar, you need basic Python language knowledge, which I assume you have, and a little bit of knowledge of API clients and Docker. As for the first, it's not strictly necessary that you have built in your life an API, but at least you know what a post or a get is. And for Docker knowledge, you just need to know what a Docker file is, what Docker Compose is, and basically how to run and build a Docker container with Docker Compose. Pretty simple, but if you don't know that, don't worry. Today we're going to cover it for sure. So it's very important to highlight the fact that the software used during this webinar is 100% free and open source. And that is really, really a plus for basically a developer, because he has the possibility to build whatever application for free on your local host. So FastAPI is pretty recent Python framework that leverage all modern Python features. And for modern, I mean 3.6 or above Pythonic features. And an example, the type hints, strings, data classes, the use of asynchronous code with two important keywords, the async and the wait, and the AskGI servers. If you're familiar, in particular with this, with respect to this point, if you're familiar with Flask or Django, you know that they use in their backend the Whiskey server, basically the web service gateway interface servers. And basically that is the Python standard for compatibility between web servers, frameworks, and applications. What's the problem? That the Whiskey don't work for async and await operations. And therefore, if you want to use asynchronous code in your application, you need an SGA server, namely an asynchronous server gateway interface. And one of them is the UVcorn. And today we're going to use the UVcorn as SGI server. So today we're going to understand basically how to build an API with FastAPI. But please note that I'm building a course for this topic for Cloud Academy. And again, stay tuned to get more on this topic in the next few weeks. Okay. Having said that, let's jump strictly to the meat of today, which is FastAPI. So I want to start with a fun fact. So this is a tweet from Sebastian Ramirez, actually the creator of FastAPI. I don't know whether this truly happened or not. In my opinion, this is actually a truly great marketing campaign to promote FastAPI among software engineers. And as you know, software engineers love this kind of post. But anyway, this is a great idea because this post went out on July, basically last year. And it says, I saw a job post the other day. It requires 4+ years of experience in FastAPI. I couldn't apply as I only have 1.5+ years of experience since I created that thing. So actually, it's quite fun. It's quite funny as a tweet. And the bottom line is, in my opinion, is that FastAPI has become very trending in the last 1 year, in the last year. And honestly, that makes sense because it's great. It is fast, not because it's faster in terms of efficiency, but it's fast because building a working API or app is pretty easy with FastAPI. And we will see today that that is true. And you can easily compare the quality and the way in which you build an API with FastAPI compared to other frameworks such as Flask or Django. So having said that, I have to say that FastAPI has a great documentation. So one of the key facts about its popularity is that it has a very nice documentation. And if you go into the documentation, and in particular you visit the GitHub repository of that particular project, you will notice a very interesting fact that I now mention. And FastAPI actually it has 33K stars. And actually, apart from the fact that it's quite a lot for a project that was built 3 years ago, you can basically compare FastAPI with, let's say, Flask. And if you go and jump into the GitHub repository of Flask, you will see that Flask has approximately 55K actually, if I remember correctly. And the difference is that Flask was built 11 years ago and FastAPI was built 3 years ago. And that's quite impressive because FastAPI has 33K stars compared to 55K. So if star means something, and for developers means something for sure, this means that there is quite an interest in FastAPI in the last couple of years. So it has a good documentation. It is very popular, especially for Python users, because it uses in the backend the Pydantic library to validate the data, and we will understand how Pydantic works today. And last but not least, it uses open API documentation, and this means that you can actually document your API in a very smoother way compared to other frameworks such as Django or Flask. So, as I said, FastAPI requires UVcorn, and as I said before, UVcorn is a lightning fast SGI server, basically, and it runs asynchronous Python web code in a single process. That's the most important fact. And so if you want to install, so basically if you want your app to be a working app in your local environment, you have to install with the pip manager the FastAPI library and the UVcorn library. So that's very, very important. And I will come to the pip install stuff when I'm going to speak about the environment in a couple of minutes. The most important fact now is to understand the learning objectives. You are here because you are interested in FastAPI for sure. And so it's important that you understand what we are going to cover today. At the end of this webinar, I suppose you will be able to understand the fundamentals of FastAPI, and that's pretty important. Also, you will learn standard security fundamentals in FastAPI, and with security fundamentals, basically I mean authentication. So we will build an API that requires authentication at the end for security reasons. And then you will be able to build a natural language processing FastAPI application to perform sentiment analysis. So that's the objective of the main objective from my side actually is to use a FastAPI to build a natural language processing app. And this natural language processing app is actually used to perform sentiment analysis. Therefore, you will ingest some text, you will get a probability output that tells you whether that piece of text is good or bad. Okay, and finally, I'm sure we will have time to do that. I said it's a stretch goal, but for me, it's going to be a real goal, is to deploy such kind of application that we are going to build today using Docker. That's why I require you to know to have a little knowledge of Docker, especially on how to write a Docker file and how to build a container with Docker Compose, because we're going to use it. Okay. As for the environment, we're going to work basically on with this webinar on my local env. But if you want to follow the webinar, you can actually install the latest version of the Docker on your local env and install the Python requirements you find in the requirements.txt file in the GitHub repo. Okay. Otherwise, if you want just to follow the webinar, don't worry, because at the end, as I said, you will find all the material uploaded in that particular repository. Okay, so let's get started with our Hello World demo for data science. And in particular, so this is actually my local env. I have cloned the GitHub repository, and I'm gonna pull basically the latest version, so everything is up to date, so no problem from my side. And let me just describe a little bit our environment. So You see here requirements.txt file that I was just mentioning a minute ago. And here, this contains all the libraries that are used for the Python backend. In particular, you see FastAPI and the UVicorn, as I was mentioning before. Those are two fundamentals libraries for FastAPI. Torch and Transformers are two libraries that are used especially for natural language processing, and we will speak a little bit in a few moments about them. It's not the focus of this webinar, but we're gonna give you a little introduction on those. And then there are, this is not a requirement, it's a typo, it's, forget about that. It's not strictly necessary, I will delete it. And then you have those two Python libraries, especially the request is used to make a request from a Python script to the API, to the working API. Okay, so having said that, let me also point out two very important files. The Docker file, which basically includes all the necessary steps that are used to create a working container. And the container we're going to build using the Docker Compose. So that's pretty easy, and in particular, our service will be called NLP Web App for simplicity. And then you have this NLP app, basically, that contains three Python files. One is called model, and we are going to fill it in a few moments, in a few minutes. In particular, this is going to be the sentiment analysis model that is going to be called by our API. Then you have a module called OAuth2, and we will understand what this means in a few seconds. But as I was saying before, there are many ways to handle security, authorization, and authentication. And in FastAPI provides different ways to authenticate a user in the API, and in particular, thanks to this security submodule from the FastAPI library, sorry. And well, we will understand how those works and how they integrate with FastAPI. And finally, you'll find this app.py file that we are gonna basically work during this webinar. But at the end, the app.py is actually the file that contains all the logic that is used inside the app, okay? So pretty simple structure, as you can see. So let's get started with the model py. So what's the point here? So what I want to build is an NLP application that actually ingests a text and returns a score, a probability score for that particular text. Say I give a review of a restaurant to my model. I expect that my model is gonna assign a score to that text, and that score can be translated into positive or negative feedback. So we want to build that particular model inside this model.py file. So how can I do that? As you see, I have started writing a sentiment analysis pipeline class. And in particular, I'm going to exploit, since I mentioned that the nice thing about FastAPI is that it uses modern Python features. I'm going to use the data classes that for sure you know if you are a Python user, but data classes is just a data class, sorry, is just a new way of defining a class. Basically, instead of defining explicitly the init, you are going to define the the arguments of the class inside the class call without specifying the init. Python 3.6 or above is smart enough to understand that you are specifying arguments for the class itself. So my sentiment analysis pipeline is nothing more than a class that will contain a method, and in particular, we can say, well, I'm going to specify an argument called pipeline name, which is a string. So my API is going to require basically one argument. My model is going to require one argument called pipeline name, and this is then defined. We're going to define a method called getModel that that is actually returning a very simple object, namely a pipeline. And so now the natural question is, what is a pipeline? What do you mean with pipeline? Here comes the magic, because you can import. I said that we're going to use the transformer library. Transformer is a very popular natural language processing library from Hugging Face, a New York City-based company that is actually providing state-of-the-art models for natural language processing and understanding pipelines, and it's pretty cool. So I'm sure that most of you have come on their website and they at least use their models. It's pretty cool as a company, but even with their base code, it's amazing. And it gives you the possibility to use pre-trained transformer models in an easy way. That's the main goal, their main goal. So their base code is amazing, as I said. So I suggest you to check their documentation in order to get more on transformers. And among many methods that they built, there is this nice pipeline object, like a class, that is used to build very dynamic and very fast natural language processing pipelines using transformers. And what you have to do is just to import from transformers the pipeline object. Here we have also to import from data classes. We have to import the data class. Sorry for that. And as I said, you just need to basically return a pipeline from the Hugging Face transformer library. And we are going to basically return a pipeline with the pipeline name that you specify inside this model. I strongly suggest you to check the documentation of Hugging Face. So if you have never heard about pipelines from Hugging Face, you can just Google Hugging Face transformers pipeline and you will get a documentation. You will see that it's pretty easy as an object. And the nice fact is that by default, this is gonna upload a tokenizer and a model depending on the pipeline you choose. Typically for sentiment analysis is a pairs for sequence classification, but you can even specify a particular model that can be downloaded from their hub, or you can even upload on their hub your particular model and use that particular model for your analysis. So check it out because it's pretty interesting. Okay, so we have built basically a simple model that actually, given a pipeline name, is going to return a pipeline with an initialized model and tokenizer that is going to be used by our API. Okay, sounds good. So this is the first step. The second step that I want to mention now is the following. So if we go here on the OAuth2 Python file, you see a few things. In particular, you see a method called getCurrentUser that ingests a string, which is a token. And this ingestion is actually a dependency injection. And this is specified by the depends class from FastAPI. And just to put in simple terms, FastAPI has a very powerful dependency injection system. And for those who don't know what a dependency injection system is, dependency injection in programming means that there is a way for your code to declare things that it requires to work and use. And basically, those are called dependencies. And in our case, FastAPI, which is our system, will take care of doing whatever is needed to provide your code with those dependencies. And that's why it's called injection, because you actually inject the dependency directly using these methods, depends, okay? So that's pretty simple, because FastAPI has this nice method called depends that actually perform for us dependency injection. And this is pretty useful, especially when you want to build some methods that have shared logic. Think about having n methods. All of them share 3 lines of code that are similar in each single method. Well, you can build a single method and inject that particular method on the other n methods using the depends. Or you can share the database connection, or even you can enforce security and authentication, as we are going to perform now. So all of these minimize the code repetition. This is very important, and make your base code more efficient. That's the most important thing. So what you see here in this file is that I want to basically build an API using FastAPI and using transformers in order to perform sentiment analysis. But I want my API to be somehow secure. And with security, I mean just a few people can access to that. And therefore, you can actually perform some authentication step before using that particular API. And in particular, we are going to use the OAuth2 authentication. And to perform dependency in the getCurrentUser, we basically require to generate that FastAPI is going to generate a password bearer for us, and we actually inject the dependency of the fact that only users with particular authentication characteristics can access to the FastAPI. And this is, I just wrote for you for simplicity. It's pretty simple, because we are going to see that our user that is going to access to our FastAPI is called Tony Stark. So Tony Stark has the possibility to access to the FastAPI. If the user is not Tony Stark, he cannot access to our FastAPI application. And if the user is not Tony Stark, we will see that we get an exception error, and in particular, we get the message that the token is not valid. So this is pretty standard as a way to authenticate in API with an API. But the nice thing is that the FastAPI has the security module that makes our life pretty easy, and with just one line of code, which is line 4, with the OAuth2 password bearer, you are going basically to create bearer, which is injected inside the get current user. And just to make things clear, this method that you see here is then called inside the login method that we are going to understand now. And if you pay attention, this login method is called by the API in order to authenticate and authorize people. And just to put in simple terms, the OAuth2 password request form that you see here as injection is a class dependency that declares a form body with username and password. And those username and password are then called inside here. So I don't want to spend too much time here. The most important thing for you to understand is that with FastAPI, you can build secure applications with just a few lines of codes. And believe me, if you are not very used to build APIs, meaning that you are not a developer, you possibly don't know the struggle that a developer has to perform when he wants to build some APIs with, let's say, Django or Flask. Here it's pretty easy. With just a few lines of code, you allow a user or a set of users to access to that particular API. And so it's pretty brilliant from my side. Okay, so let me jump straight to, we said that we build a model. Now we have to build the app. And this is actually the motivation for which you are here today. So the question is, how can I build an API with FastAPI? That's pretty easy. What you have to do basically is to import from FastAPI also the FastAPI class. So be sure that you import the FastAPI from FastAPI. This is already filled for you. It's just, as I said before, it's just a way to pass to the class username and password. But again, don't care at this time, at this stage of your learning process. Don't care too much about the security submodule. It's very important, but the most important thing that is you understand how to build a FastAPI from scratch. Okay, what we can do is the following. So we create an app and we call the FastAPI, and basically we have initialized an object called app. And a very important step now is to basically create two important requests. One request that we're going to make is a GET request. And in particular, we are going to create a root, basically, that displays a welcome message. And then we are going to build a POST request that is actually accepting a text to perform sentiment analysis. So now we have two objectives in mind: to create two requests, one GET and one POST. And the GET is going basically to display a welcome message in our app, and the POST is going to ingest some data, in our case a text, to perform sentiment analysis. So the code, it's pretty simple, and that's why I love FastAPI, because with just a few commands, you are going to build a working API. So the question is, how can I do that? Well, let's start with the root GET request. So I can define, let me say, GET root. This is nothing more than I want to define a GET, a request that is actually returning a message. And so I specify this as a the Python dictionary. And for instance, the message is, this is a sentiment analysis pipeline, sorry. And so this is basically the method. And the way in which we are telling Python, in particular FastAPI, that is actually a GET request. What you have to specify is the decorator app.get. And in particular, you say that you specify the path. In our case, it's just the root, because we are defining the root of our API. And with just this decorator, you are told Python that the getRoot method is going to be used by FastAPI to get the root of your application. It's amazing, right? So with just a simple specification, a decorator that comes from the FastAPI library, we have built the first request of our API. Okay, so this is the easiest part, because now we have basically to define also the post request that requires a text to be ingested and returns a score probability for that particular text. And how can I do that? So, not surprisingly, we are going to build a post request, and therefore we are going to use the decorator post app.post. And here we are going also to specify the path for our application. And without using too much creativity, I'm going to call it sentiment analysis, okay? So our app is going to be called through the path sentiment analysis. And I can define a method, and in particular, I'm going to call this sentiment analysis again. Not too much creativity from my side, but the most important thing is that this method is going to ingest what? It's going to ingest the text that is used by our transformer method to perform sentiment analysis. So, as I said, we're going to specify the arguments. So text, which is a string, and also I require a username to be ingested. Why is that? If you think about, we have spoken about authorization. The authorization method, if you remember, was used to get to authorize some user or not to access to our API, and therefore we want to check actually that the user that is accessing to our sentiment analysis app is actually the one that is allowed to perform that particular step or application. So again, here it's a string, and I guess you have understood how dependency injection works. I'm going to add a dependency that comes from the get current user. And the get current user, it's a method that we created here in the OAuth2 Python file, and therefore I'm going to import it from NLP app.oauth2 file. Okay, so this actually, so we have imported FastAPI from FastAPI. We initialize an app. We built a GET request in order to get the root of our web app. We have already discussed about the login, and we are now building a sentiment analysis pipeline. So how can I build that? So remember, we have to ingest a text inside the pipeline, and we expect the pipeline to return a score, a probability score for that particular text. So at first, let me print the authenticated user, and in particular, I'm using strings. So I'm going to check that the username that we are passing is actually the one that we want. So let me say, let me print this message. It's not necessary, but it's important for us to check that everything works correctly. And then now comes the meat. We initialize a model, and in particular, I'm going to use the model that we created here, the sentiment analysis pipeline, by specifying, let me import that from the model app. And in particular, I'm going to I'm going to specify the pipeline name as in the following way. I'm going to call the pipeline name as sentiment analysis. This is the string that the transformer, Hugging Face transformer method expects from us. So just be sure that you add the sentiment minus analysis string as a pipeline name. As I said before, the Hugging Face transformers has many different pipelines. We are using these for sentiment analysis. There are many other pipelines such as summarization, language translation, question answering, and so on and so forth. Check the documentation if you're curious, because I believe it's pretty interesting, especially if you work in data science. You must know those today. And if you remember, we specified that a method called getModel that returns actually a pipeline. So once we have built this model, when we initialize the model, we can get the predictions. And the predictions is nothing more than the application of the model on the text that we are passing as argument of our class. The Hugging Face transformer, in particular, the Hugging Face pipeline transformer, is going to return for the sentiment analysis a list made, or a list of dictionary. And in particular, a dictionary has two keys, a label and a score. A label tells you the sentiment related to the text that you ingested, namely whether it was positive or negative. And the score is the probability score that we are interested in. So I'm going to say, I specify the variable sentiment, which is nothing more than the Params in position 0. And in particular, I have access to the label key of our Python dictionary. And then I have a score, which is nothing more than the, let me say, the probability score coming from the prediction. And therefore, this is nothing more than we access to the score key of the Python dictionary in position 0 of the Params. So we got the sentiment and the score. We can also print for debugging, or even you can log if you are in building a production system. But for the moment we are we are developing, so printing is fine. You can say, well, sentiment is, and you pass the sentiment with proba, and you pass the probability and say round the score 4. Okay, now we have to return something, because this is the logic that is inside our post, and then we have to return something. So the question is, what should I return? And if you remember, at the beginning I said, I want to return basically two things. given an input, which is a text, I want to return the sentiment and the score. And here comes another magic of FastAPI. And why is that? Because with a little trick, which means defining a class, a manager, using Pydantic that is gonna validate our data and execute our model. Thanks to the definition of such class, we are sure that we are gonna get a JSON response with the arguments specified in that particular class. So we need to actually define such kind of class. And for simplicity, I'm going to define this as a sentiment analysis response. And since I said we are using, I want to exploit the functionality of FastAPI, and FastAPI use Pydantic in its backend, I'm going to use the base model. We have basically to import that. And the base model is from Pydantic. We import the base model. So be sure that you import the base model from Pydantic. And therefore, we can actually create a class, a manager that is gonna validate and execute the response for us. And as I said, this class requires 2 arguments. We wanted our response to be a JSON made of 2 arguments, a sentiment and the probability. So I'm going to define the sentiment, which is a string, and a probability, which is nothing more than a float. And the nice thing is that Pydantic works very similar as data classes. I would say that a Pydantic model extends the data classes, but the interesting fact is that with just a simple definition of class without specifying any method, by adding the dependency with the base model from Pydantic, all the dirty job is made by this class. And the only thing that you have to do is specify what you expect from the response of your API. In our case, the sentiment and probability, and that's it. And once you have defined that, you go down here in the return, and what you have to do is nothing more than defining the response. And the response is going to be made of 2 arguments, the sentiment, which is nothing more than this object that you find here, stored in the variable sentiment, and the score, which is nothing more than the score that you store in the variable score in line 44. And without any other effort, you have built an API with FastAPI. And this API, now we're gonna see in a few seconds, hopefully is gonna work, and hopefully is gonna return what we expect. Okay, I believe I have explained everything. So yes, well, here we have to make a few change. So remember, the only user that is allowed to access to our API is Tony Stark, and therefore the correct username that our login is expecting is indeed Tony Stark. And this requires a password. So obviously we are in development. If you are building a production API, you are gonna deal password in a better way than the way that I'm doing now. Now I'm hard coding those, which is not good, as you know. So don't do this in production, okay? But we are going to actually hard code the password that Tony Stark used to access to the API, and the password is Iron Man, okay? Without any surprise. With this in mind, we are able to actually start and use our NLP app. Okay, so the question is, I built an API, I understood how FastAPI works. The question is, well, how can I run an API? As I said, we are going to use not a Whiskey server because of the asynchronous operation, but we are going to use an SGI server. And therefore, as an SGI server, we use uvicorn. And so from your command line, you just need to type the following command, uvicorn, and then you specify the NLP app.app. So you want to basically run this app.py file. And you map that file into the app used by FastAPI. And then you can specify the reload command if you spend. I strongly suggest to specify this, especially if you are developing your application locally. So for local development, it's pretty important. And that's it. So you just run the app. Some logging is appearing here. It says that we start running on this localhost, import 80,000, and therefore we can actually move to our working API. So let me do this because it's not incoming. Okay. So we have a working API, and remember, we have built a root, and the root, if you remember, was made by a JSON made of a message, and the message was, this is a sentiment analysis app. This is perfectly fine, so it means that our app is working correctly, and to access to the real API, you have to specify the docs into the URL here. So /docs, and if you run it, you get this nice page where you find the two posts that we defined, one for the login and one for the sentiment analysis, and one request, get request for basically our route. Here you see an authorization step, and if you click here, you get the classic OAuth 2 password bearer generation. And as I said here, you have to demonstrate to the FastAPI that we built that you are indeed Tony Stark. Okay, so you are going to say, well, I'm Tony Stark and I know my password. Remember, our password was Iron Man, and we request an authentication. The authentication was worked fine, obviously. So we are logged, okay, and so we can perform our sentiment analysis. And in particular, here is we go in here into the sentiment analysis post. You can try it out our sentiment analysis app. And for instance, I can say, well, let's say that I have a review, a text review, and I'm going to take that review here. In the README, I post a text. So I'm going to take this, this text, which is actually, it speaks about a restaurant and in particular a pizza. So this guy say, well, I love the pizza made by this guy, and I would definitely recommend this restaurant to all my friends. So it looks quite a positive description, a positive review. So what you have to do is to execute with this nice UI, and actually you can get here is not working. Why? One validation error for sentiment analysis response. Let me check what's going on. So the probability sentiment analysis response requires, it's not a score, but it's probability. Sorry for that. So you see now the reload has run for us, has reload the app for us. So what I just need to do is to go here again, re-execute. So look at here, the user Tony Stark was authenticated, and my app has responded in positive way with a probability 0.99. So it means it's a positive one. And I get also a response 200, which means that everything went fine. And here you can get the response body here. And you see that you have also the curl in order to run that particular response with from just the terminal, okay? Pretty easy. Or you can paste the URL that you see here. So you have different ways to call it, obviously. And so I love the pizza by Gaetano. It was a pretty positive one. Let's try with a negative one. So I didn't enjoy okay, so it's pretty please avoid going there. Okay, it's pretty negative one. Let's see what's happening now. We try to execute. Obviously we are getting logs again, so it's a negative with high probability, which is okay, 0.99. And then we can say, well, let's try another one. The food is fine, but the service was not as expected. Okay, let's see what's going on here. So it's a negative with 0.98. So here, possibly, if you are not fine with this sentence, which is, you know, it's negative, but it's not too much negative, I would say. Possibly a solution is to use a different models from our sentiment analysis pipeline and try to explore different eigenphase transformer methods to ingest in our pipeline. But that is obviously another work for our side. It's important that you actually know how to build a FastAPI. Okay, so in the last couple of minutes, I want to perform the following experiment with you. So instead of running locally with the basically the Ubicorn server, what I want to do is actually to build an API using the Docker Compose commands. So we are going to create build a local container, and that local container is actually containing our app that is going to be called as we did before. And therefore, we are going to use Docker Compose that actually build the Docker container from the Docker file that you see here. And what you have to do is basically writing this simple command, Docker Compose app -- build, and then you specify the name of the web application, NLP web app. For simplicity, you just need to run it, possibly on your local env. It's gonna take a few seconds, I would say a couple of minutes, because the image is pretty heavy, because it has transformers and torch, and believe me, it's gonna be more than 3 gigabytes of stuff. The most important thing here is that since it broke down, obviously, because we don't need to actually import from NLP model, but we just need model and out too. Pretty simple. Let me rebuild again. So, okay. So as you see, everything has been built correctly with the Docker Compose, which means that actually I'm in a container called NLP web app, and in that container I have built basically my app, and so all the logic is inside the container, and I can access to the app, for instance, by instead of accessing to this URL, I'm going to say, well, 0.0, sorry, 0.0.0, and I access to this port. Not surprisingly, we get this root, and here you have exactly the same environment as before, but now the interesting fact, sorry, you see here, you have access to the root, and you see here, and actually when you get to the docs, you actually are getting the same result as before. So just to give you an idea, let me go back here. So 0.0.0, 8000 docs, you get this, okay? So this is pretty much everything that I want to discuss with you. I hope you have enjoyed, and now I'm here to answer to your questions. Okay, so I see many questions. Let's try to answer to all of your questions. So can you go a bit more in depth in how the dependency injection works in FastAPI? And how about the dependency injection? I'm not entirely sure about its use, for example, for the authorization step. So that's quite a good question. I would say the following. So the dependency injection is actually, obviously you have to check the documentation because it's pretty rich. And for our particular case, if you remember, we have used this OAuth2 password request form. So this is nothing more than a wrapper that is actually getting the username and password coming from this form data. And the form data is actually the call of this get current user method, which requires a token. And if I understand correctly your question, you want to understand how this method works. And as I said before, this method is actually gonna handle for you two things: the username and the password that is passed from this token URL. Okay, So from when you call this or this line with this method, store in line 4 in the OAuth2 scheme, that is going to return basically the username and password, and therefore you just need to call this simple class, and all the dirty job is made by the wrapper, the FastAPI wrapper, that I suggest you to check by yourself on the documentation, that is going to wrap basically and ingest the return of that call inside the login. Okay, so that was the first question. The second question, how is it text parsed from the request JSON? How can you specify query params or other stuff? That's pretty nice question. So in order to answer it directly, what I typically do for the query params, since I typically develop with Python and I want to pass, let me say, a request body, I'm using directly Python with the request. So for instance, here in the README, I specified a simple example here, and actually I specify everything here. But again, you have thousands of possibility that I don't have the time to cover here. The documentation is pretty direct, and you can actually try to play with other parameters. But typically, what you have to do is actually create a class, a Pydantic class, that is actually going to take care of the parameters. For instance, just to give you a practical example, here we are saying that the sentiment and the probability are two arguments for our API request that are mandatory. In case you want those to be optional, you just need to say that those are optional in this way. Optional, it's not working. Why is okay, yeah. Okay, so or you can even specify another one, say, I don't know, extra param. If you want to say, well, this extra param is nothing more than a default param, say Tony Stark, okay? And in this way, the extra param is not necessary inside the query params, but you know that your sentiment analysis response might have an extra parameter inside the request that is called extra param. So at the end of the day, what you have to do is specifying everything inside this class, and this class is gonna deal everything related to the ingestion in the request, or in our case, in the output of the request, because this is obviously an output, but you can create the same logic with an input class, and the query parameter can be easily managed by this class. Then last, how can I specify different port? Well, you have many ways to do that. You can specify in the Docker file, or even you can, if you remember, you can call the Uvicorn my app, and then you specify the port in this way, and you say, well, not 8000, but 8080, for instance. That's pretty direct. Again, the Uvicorn has a great documentation. If you have any doubt, you can check it. Okay, so I see other couple of questions. How can I access to the OpenAI documentation you mentioned? Okay, it's good. That's pretty easy. You can go here, instead of docs, you can use the Redux. Redux, sorry, not Redux. And you get here the OpenAPI documentation for your post and for your get. Thanks for asking. Okay, for me, that's pretty much. Thank you for the attention. And if you have any doubt or any curiosity, you can direct message on LinkedIn, and it will be a pleasure to help you or to help you in answering your doubts. Thank you.
All right, that's it for today. Thank you to Andrea for leading this session, and of course to our audience. We hope you enjoyed it. Before we part ways, just a couple of reminders. As mentioned, this session was recorded, so you will receive the recording via email as soon as it is available. We do have an end of webinar survey, and we'd really appreciate you if you could answer it, because our followers and our audience's feedback is always very welcome, and it helps us improve and propose topics that you're interested in. If you missed Andrea's past webinars, you can find them on our website, specifically on cloudacademy.com/webinars. We did a series called Pandas Like a Boss, and then you'll find other sessions that he led. And on that same section, so the webinar sections of the Cloud Academy website, you will also see that we've just launched a new machine learning series led by Andrea starting in September. So you will find all of the sign up links there. Again, thank you for joining us, and until next time, goodbye, everybody.